The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the rows of empty benches. It was Monday morning in Cedar Falls, Indiana, and Judge Harold Whitmore sat behind his elevated desk like a king surveying his domain. His silver hair was combed back with precision, his black robe pressed and immaculate. For 32 years he had presided over this room, and in that time he had developed what he called instincts. He could tell, he often said, the character of a man the moment he walked through those double doors. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Patterson, stood near the side entrance, clipboard in hand. The morning docket was light. A few traffic violations, a property dispute between neighbors. Nothing that would require more than routine attention. Judge Whitmore preferred these quiet mornings. They allowed him to move through cases efficiently, to maintain the order he valued above all else. At precisely 9:15, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound echoed through the chamber, and Judge Whitmore looked up from his paperwork. What he saw made his jaw tighten. A man walked down the center aisle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with arms thick as fence posts. His hair was gray and pulled back into a short ponytail. A beard, neatly trimmed but undeniably rugged, covered the lower half of his face. He wore a leather vest over a simple black t-shirt, and on the back of that vest was a patch, a skull with wings, surrounded by words the judge could not read from this distance. His boots were heavy, the kind that announced each step with authority. Silver rings glinted on his fingers. A chain hung from his belt loop to his back pocket. Judge Whitmore felt his spine stiffen. He had seen men like this before. Not often in his courtroom, but enough times in his life to form an opinion. These were men who lived outside the lines, who treated the law as a suggestion rather than a commandment. They rode their motorcycles through quiet towns, disturbing the peace, intimidating decent citizens with their appearance alone. They were, in the judge's experience, trouble waiting to happen. The man approached the front of the courtroom and stopped at the defendant's table. He did not sit. He simply stood there, hands clasped in front of him, eyes forward. There was no lawyer beside him, no nervous shuffling, just stillness. Patterson cleared his throat and read from his clipboard. The case was a noise complaint. A neighbor had filed against the man, Marcus Cole was his name, claiming that loud engines and gatherings at his property had disturbed the peace on multiple occasions over the past month. It was a civil matter, barely worth the court's time, but the neighbor had insisted on pressing it. Judge Whitmore removed his reading glasses and set them on the desk. He leaned forward, studying the man before him. "You are Marcus Cole," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied. His voice was deep but calm, respectful even. The judge glanced at the paperwork. "According to this complaint, you have been hosting gatherings at your residence that have caused significant noise disturbances. Motorcycles arriving at all hours, music, shouting." Marcus Cole nodded slowly. "There have been gatherings, Your Honor. I will not deny that." Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "And you see nothing wrong with that? Disturbing your neighbors? Making them feel unsafe in their own homes?" For a moment, something flickered across Marcus Cole's face. It was not anger. It was something closer to sorrow. But it passed quickly, replaced by that same steady calm. "I understand how it might appear, Your Honor," he said. "But if you would allow me to explain the nature of these gatherings, I believe you might see them differently." The judge held up a hand. "I have seen enough, Mr. Cole. I know exactly what kind of gatherings men like you hold. I have dealt with your kind before. You come into quiet communities, you make noise, you intimidate people, and then you stand in my courtroom and expect me to believe you are misunderstood." The words hung in the air like smoke. Patterson shifted uncomfortably near the door. Even the court reporter, a young woman named Diana, who had worked for the judge for 3 years, paused her typing. Marcus Cole did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the judge with eyes that held something the judge did not expect. Patience. "Your Honor," he began. but the judge cut him off. "I am not finished." Judge Whitmore stood, his robe billowing slightly with the motion. "I have dedicated my life to maintaining order in this community, to protecting decent, hard-working people from those who would disrupt their peace. And I will not sit here and listen to excuses from a man who clearly has no respect for the law or for the people around him." The courtroom was silent. The fluorescent lights continued their quiet hum. Outside, a bird sang somewhere in the trees that lined the courthouse lawn. Marcus Cole took a slow breath. He looked at the judge, and when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still measured. "I served 24 years in the United States Marine Corps, Your Honor. 3 tours overseas. I have held dying men in my arms and promised their mothers I would bring them home. I have buried friends whose names are carved into walls that most people only visit on holidays. And when I came home, broken in ways that do not show on the outside, I found a brotherhood that helped me heal." He paused, letting the words settle. "The gatherings at my home are not parties. They are meetings of the Iron Guardians, a motorcycle club made up entirely of veterans, men and women who served this country and came back carrying wounds that no one can see. We meet to support each other, to remind each other that we are not alone. And yes, sometimes there are motorcycles and sometimes there is noise. But there is also purpose. There is also healing." Judge Whitmore stared at the man before him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself without words. Marcus Cole reached into the inside pocket of his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out toward the bailiff. "This is a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs," he said. "It confirms that the Iron Guardians have been recognized as a non-profit organization dedicated to veteran mental health support. We have helped over 300 veterans in this state alone. 12 of them credit our brotherhood with saving their lives." Patterson took the letter and walked it to the judge's desk. Judge Whitmore unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the official letterhead, the signatures, the commendations. The silence stretched on. "I did not come here to cause trouble, Your Honor," Marcus continued. "I came because I respect this court and the law it represents. But I will not apologize for helping my brothers and sisters. Not today. Not ever." Judge Whitmore set the letter down. He looked at Marcus Cole, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw past the leather and the beard and the chains. He saw the medals that were not pinned to the vest, but carried invisibly in the man's bearing. He saw the quiet dignity of someone who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. The judge sat back down. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." The words seemed to cost him something. Judge Harold Whitmore had not apologized from that bench in over a decade, but as he looked at the veteran standing before him, he realized that his instincts, the instincts he had trusted for 32 years, had failed him. "I judged you by your appearance," he continued. "I made assumptions based on what I thought I knew, rather than what was actually true. That was wrong, and it was beneath the standards of this court." Marcus Cole nodded once. "No need to apologize, Your Honor. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. All I ask is that you see us for who we are, not for what we look like." The judge was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up his gavel. "This case is dismissed," he said. "And Mr. Cole, thank you for your service and for your patience." Marcus Cole gave a small nod, turned, and walked back down the center aisle. His boots echoed against the floor, but this time the sound was different. It was not the march of a troublemaker. It was the steady stride of a man who had faced far greater battles than a courtroom could offer. As the doors closed behind him, Judge Whitmore sat alone in the silence. He looked at the letter still sitting on his desk, and he realized that today, in his own courtroom, he had been the one who learned a lesson. But this story does not end here. In fact, it has barely begun. Because what happened next would change not only Judge Harold Whitmore's understanding of justice, but the entire town of Cedar Falls itself. And it all started with a single phone call that came just 3 days later. check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of courage, honor, and the power of second chances move your heart, then you belong here with us. Subscribe now and become part of a community that believes in the good that still exists in this world. 3 days after the courtroom encounter, Judge Harold Whitmore sat in his study at home, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him. The room was lined with books, legal texts, biographies of great jurists, volumes of case law he had consulted throughout his career. A framed photograph of his late wife, Eleanor, sat on the corner of the desk. She had passed 4 years ago, and in the quiet evenings, he often found himself talking to her picture as if she could still hear him. Tonight, his mind was elsewhere. He could not stop thinking about Marcus Cole, the way the man had stood there calm and dignified while the judge hurled accusations at him. The way he had not raised his voice, had not shown anger, had simply told the truth and let it speak for itself. Harold Whitmore had spent his entire career believing he could read people. And in one morning, a biker in a leather vest had proven him wrong. He reached for the whiskey, but did not drink it. Instead, he picked up the letter that Marcus had given him, the letter from the VA, confirming the Iron Guardian's work with veterans. He had read it a dozen times since Monday, and each time he noticed something new. A statistic about veteran mental health, a testimonial from a family member, a list of community events the club had organized. These were not criminals. These were protectors. The phone on his desk rang, startling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock. It was past 9. Late for a call, especially on a weeknight. He picked up the receiver. "Judge Whitmore," he said. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Tom Bradley, the Cedar Falls chief of police. Harold had known Tom for nearly 20 years. They played golf together on Saturdays when the weather allowed. "Harold," Tom said, his voice tight, "I need you to come down to the station. There is something you need to see." The judge frowned. "What is it?" "I cannot explain over the phone. Just come, please." 20 minutes later, Judge Whitmore walked through the front doors of the Cedar Falls police station. The building was small, just a single floor with a handful of offices and a few holding cells in the back. Tom was waiting for him in the lobby, his face drawn and serious. "Follow me," Tom said without preamble. They walked down a narrow hallway and into a room that served as the station's makeshift command center. On a table in the center of the room, several folders were spread out, along with photographs and printed documents. Tom closed the door behind them. "What is this about?" Judge Whitmore asked. Tom pointed to one of the photographs. It showed a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with dark hair and a thin face. His eyes were large and sad, the kind of eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "This is Danny Reeves," Tom said. "He lives on the outskirts of town with his mother and stepfather. 3 days ago, one of our officers responded to a call at their residence. The mother claimed it was a misunderstanding, and we had no grounds to investigate further." The judge studied the photograph. "What kind of call?" A neighbor heard shouting, loud enough to be concerned. The officer who responded said the boy looked frightened but would not speak. The stepfather was polite, cooperative, said everything was fine. "And you let it go?" Tom's jaw tightened. "We had no evidence, Harold. No marks, no statements, nothing actionable. You know how these things work." Our hands were tied. Judge Whitmore felt a familiar frustration rise in his chest. He had seen cases like this before, situations where everyone knew something was wrong, but the system could not act without proof. It was one of the great failures of the law he had sworn to uphold. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. Tom reached for another photograph and slid it across the table. "Because of this." The image showed a gas station on the edge of town. In the foreground, a boy, Danny Reeves, was standing near the entrance. Behind him, barely visible in the frame, was a man in a leather vest. The skull and wings patch was unmistakable. "This was taken yesterday afternoon," Tom said. "The station owner called us because he thought the boy was lost. By the time we got there, both the boy and the biker were gone." but I pulled the security footage. He walked to a laptop on the table and pressed play. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. Danny Reeves entered the gas station alone, his clothes wrinkled and dirty. He moved quickly, nervously, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. He went straight to the counter and spoke to the attendant, but the audio was too muffled to hear. The attendant shook his head, and the boy's shoulders slumped. Then the door opened, and Marcus Cole walked in. He did not approach the boy immediately. He bought a bottle of water and a bag of chips, exchanging a few words with the attendant. But Judge Whitmore noticed the way his eyes moved, scanning the room, assessing the situation, taking in every detail. When he turned and saw Danny standing near the door, he paused. The footage showed Marcus walking toward the boy slowly, carefully, the way one might approach a frightened animal. He knelt down to the boy's level and said something. Danny looked up, his eyes wide. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. Marcus placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder and led him out of the gas station. "That is the last we see of them," Tom said, pausing the footage. The attendant said the biker asked the boy if he was okay. The boy said he was looking for help. Said he did not want to go home. Judge Whitmore stared at the frozen image on the screen. "Where is the boy now?" "We do not know," Tom admitted. "We went to the Reeves residence this morning. The mother said Danny ran away 2 days ago. She filed a missing persons report, but she did not seem particularly concerned. And the stepfather, he stood in the doorway the whole time, arms crossed, like he was daring us to ask questions." The judge felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you asking me to do, Tom?" The chief of police met his eyes. "I am asking you to help me find that boy. Legally, there is nothing more I can do without evidence. But I have a feeling that Marcus Cole knows more than we do, and I think you might be the only person in this town who can get him to talk." Judge Whitmore thought about the courtroom 3 days ago, the way he had dismissed Marcus Cole as a criminal before the man had even spoken, the way Marcus had responded with grace and truth. He owed the man an apology. Perhaps now he owed him something more. "I will find him," the judge said quietly, "and I will find out what he knows." He did not know then that the search would lead him into a world he had never understood, a world of loyalty, brotherhood, and a kind of justice that existed outside the walls of any courtroom. He did not know that the boy named Danny Reeves was about to change everything he believed about right and wrong, but he was about to learn. The Iron Guardians clubhouse sat at the end of a gravel road on the eastern edge of Cedar Falls, surrounded by oak trees that had stood for 100 years. The building itself was an old converted barn, its red paint faded but its structure solid. A row of motorcycles lined the front, chrome glinting in the afternoon sun. An American flag hung from a pole near the entrance, and beneath it, a smaller flag bearing the club's emblem, the skull with wings, the symbol that Judge Whitmore had once viewed with suspicion and now viewed with something closer to curiosity. He parked his sedan near the edge of the lot and sat for a moment gathering his thoughts. He had called ahead, and Marcus Cole had agreed to meet him. But as the judge stepped out of his car and walked toward the clubhouse, he could not shake the feeling that he was entering a world where his title and his robe meant nothing. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood in the entrance, mid-50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a braid and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a leather vest similar to Marcus's, but hers bore a different patch. "Road Captain. Judge Whitmore," she said. Her voice was neither warm nor cold. Neutral, like a soldier awaiting orders. "Yes," he replied. "I am here to see Marcus Cole." She nodded and stepped aside. "He is expecting you." The interior of the clubhouse was not what the judge had imagined. He had expected darkness, perhaps, or the rough chaos of a bar. Instead, he found a large open space filled with light from windows set high in the walls. Tables and chairs were arranged neatly. A kitchen area occupied one corner, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. On the walls hung photographs, not of motorcycles, but of men and women in military uniforms, standing in deserts and jungles and on the decks of ships. "This way," the woman said, leading him toward a back room. Marcus Cole sat at a wooden table, a mug of coffee in front of him. He looked up as the judge entered, and something passed between them. Not quite acknowledgement, but something close. A recognition that the circumstances had changed. "Judge Whitmore," Marcus said, rising to shake his hand. "I was not expecting to see you again so soon." The judge took a seat across from him. "Neither was I, Mr. Cole, but circumstances have changed." He explained what Tom Bradley had shown him, the photograph of Danny Reeves, the gas station footage, the boy's disappearance. He watched Marcus's face as he spoke, looking for any sign of deception. He found none. When the judge finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands, staring at the dark liquid inside. "The boy is safe," he said finally. "That is the first thing you need to know. He is not missing. He is being protected." "Protected from what?" Marcus looked up, and the judge saw something in his eyes, a cold anger, tightly controlled. The same kind of anger the judge had seen in veterans who had witnessed things they could not forget. "From a man who should never have been allowed near children," Marcus said quietly. "The stepfather, Daniel Marsh. I knew his name before I ever met that boy. One of our members served with a man whose sister married Marsh 5 years ago. She disappeared 8 months later. No one has heard from her since." The judge felt the cold settle deeper. "Are you saying this man is dangerous?" "I am saying he is careful," Marcus replied. "Careful enough to avoid leaving marks. Careful enough to make sure there are no witnesses. But I have seen men like him before, Your Honor. They wear masks. They smile at neighbors and shake hands at church, and behind closed doors, they become something else entirely." He leaned forward. "That boy came to me because he had nowhere else to go. He walked 6 miles from his house to that gas station because he had heard somewhere that bikers help people, that we protect those who cannot protect themselves. And when I looked into his eyes, I saw the same look I saw in the children we tried to help overseas. The look of someone who has given up hope." Judge Whitmore was silent. He thought about the system he had devoted his life to, the laws, the procedures, the carefully constructed mechanisms of justice, and he realized, not for the first time, that those mechanisms sometimes failed, that there were cracks in the foundation wide enough for monsters to slip through. "Where is the boy now?" he asked. Marcus shook his head. "With respect, Your Honor, I am not going to tell you that. Not because I do not trust you, but because I do not trust the system you represent. If I hand that boy over to Child Protective Services, he will be returned to his mother within a week, and his mother will return him to that house. And what happens after that will be on my conscience." The judge opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because he knew Marcus was right. He had seen it happen before. Children returned to dangerous homes because the paperwork was not sufficient, because the evidence was not conclusive, because the system prioritized process over protection. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest and pulled out a small notebook. He slid it across the table. "That boy has been keeping a record," he said. "Dates, times, things that were said and done." He started writing it down 2 years ago, after his mother told him no one would believe him. He thought if he had proof, someone might listen. The judge opened the notebook. The handwriting was small and careful, the words of a child trying desperately to be believed. As he read, his hands began to shake. "This is enough," he whispered. "This is enough to open an investigation, to remove him from that home, to press charges." Marcus nodded. "That is what I hoped you would say." "But I need more than an investigation, Your Honor. I need your word that you will see this through, that you will not let this boy fall through the cracks." Judge Harold Whitmore closed the notebook. He looked at the man sitting across from him, the biker, the veteran, the protector, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his career. "You have my word," he said. "I will not let him down." For the first time since the judge had entered the clubhouse, Marcus Cole smiled. It was a small smile, tired but genuine. "Then we have work to do," he said. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just between two men, but in the very fabric of what justice could mean in a small town called Cedar Falls. If this story is touching your heart, leave a comment right now saying, "A real hero does not wear a cape. He wears a vest." Leave that comment and let us see how many of us believe in this truth. The investigation began quietly, as such things often do. Judge Whitmore brought Danny Reeves's notebook to Tom Bradley that same evening, and the chief of police read it with the same shaking hands the judge had experienced. By morning, a formal inquiry had been opened. Child Protective Services was notified. A social worker was assigned, and Daniel Marsh, the stepfather, was brought in for questioning. But if anyone expected the man to crumble under pressure, they were disappointed. Daniel Marsh was 43 years old, with the kind of forgettable face that blended into crowds. He was neither tall nor short, neither handsome nor ugly. He worked as an accountant for a firm in the neighboring county, and his colleagues described him as quiet and professional. At church, he volunteered for the annual food drive. At neighborhood gatherings, he smiled and made small talk about the weather. In the interrogation room, he was calm, cooperative even. He answered every question with patience, expressed concern for his stepson's welfare, and denied any wrongdoing with the smooth confidence of a man who had rehearsed for this moment. "The boy has had difficulties," Marsh said, his voice even. "His biological father left when he was young. There have been behavioral issues, running away, making up stories. His mother and I have done everything we can to help him, but children sometimes lash out at those who love them most." Tom Bradley listened, his face betraying nothing. But inside, he was seething. He had seen men like this before. Men who knew exactly what to say, exactly how to say it, exactly how to twist the truth until it became unrecognizable. The problem was proof. Danny's notebook was compelling, but a defense attorney could argue it was the fantasy of a troubled child. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without something concrete, the case would collapse. And Daniel Marsh knew it. 2 days later, the social worker conducted a home visit. Danny's mother, Linda Reeves, met her at the door with tears in her eyes. She spoke of her son's struggles, his tendency to invent stories, his refusal to accept discipline. She showed the social worker Danny's room, clean, well-kept, filled with toys and books. She presented herself as a devoted mother doing her best under difficult circumstances. The social worker wrote in her report that she found no evidence of an unsafe environment. She recommended continued monitoring, but saw no grounds for removal. When Judge Whitmore read the report, he felt something crack inside him. He had promised Marcus Cole that he would not let the boy fall through the cracks. And here he was, watching the system fail exactly as Marcus had predicted. That evening, he drove to the Iron Guardians clubhouse. Marcus was waiting for him outside, leaning against his motorcycle with his arms crossed. He did not say anything as the judge approached. He did not need to. His expression said everything. "I am not giving up," the judge said. Marcus studied him. "I know you are not. But knowing and doing are two different things." He pushed off from the motorcycle and walked toward the clubhouse. The judge followed. Inside, the main room was fuller than before. A dozen men and women sat at the tables, all wearing the leather vests of the Iron Guardians. They looked up as the judge entered, and he felt the weight of their collective gaze. Marcus gestured to a seat at the center table. The judge sat. "We have been talking," Marcus said, taking a seat across from him, "about what can be done, about what should be done." One of the other members, a woman with short gray hair and a scar along her jawline, spoke up. Her name was Rita, and she had served 2 tours as an army medic. "The system is designed to protect itself," she said, "not the people it claims to serve. We have all seen it. Cases that should be open and shut, buried under paperwork. Children returned to homes where they are not safe, and men like Daniel Marsh walking free because they know how to play the game. The judge felt the accusation in her words, even though it was not directed at him specifically. She was describing a system he had been part of for over 3 decades, a system he had believed in. "So, what are you proposing?" he asked. Marcus leaned forward. "We are proposing that we do what we always do. We protect those who cannot protect themselves. And we make sure the truth comes out." The judge frowned. "How?" Another member spoke. A young man named Tomas, barely 30, with tattoos covering both arms and eyes that held a quiet intensity. He had served in military intelligence before a combat injury ended his career. "Marsh has patterns," Tomas said. "All men like him do. They cannot help themselves. They think they are smarter than everyone else, that they will never get caught, and that arrogance is their weakness." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, documents, printouts. Before his current wife, Marsh was married twice, Thomas continued. Both marriages ended quietly. Both women refused to speak about what happened. But I did some digging, and I found something interesting. He pointed to a photograph of a woman in her 40s, standing outside a small house with a for sale sign in the yard. "This is Helen Marsh, Daniel's first wife. She lives in Kentucky now. Changed her name, moved 3 times in 5 years. She has never spoken publicly about her marriage. But 2 weeks ago she posted something on a private support forum, a forum for women who have survived relationships with controlling men." The judge looked at the photograph, then at Thomas. "What did she say?" Thomas met his eyes. "She said she spent 8 years believing no one would ever believe her. She said she has evidence, recordings, photographs, documentation, that she has kept locked away because she was too afraid to come forward. But she also said that if she ever heard of another victim, she would find the courage." The room was silent. Marcus spoke quietly. "We are not asking you to bend the law, Your Honor. We are asking you to help us find the truth. And once we have it, we are asking you to make sure justice is served." Judge Whitmore looked around the room, at the veterans, the survivors, the protectors. He thought about the oath he had taken, the robe he wore, the system he had served. And he thought about a 9-year-old boy who had walked 6 miles to ask a stranger for help. "Tell me what you need," he said. The drive to Kentucky took 6 hours. Judge Whitmore rode in the passenger seat of Marcus Cole's pickup truck, watching the landscape change from the flat farmland of Indiana to the rolling hills of the Bluegrass State. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 men who understood that some things did not need words. Helen Marsh, Helen Porter as she now called herself, lived in a small town called Willow Creek, population 3,000. Her house was a modest ranch-style home at the end of a quiet street, with a garden out front and a rusted swing set in the backyard that suggested children had once lived there. She met them at the door with wary eyes. She was thin, with graying hair and a nervous habit of touching the collar of her shirt. But beneath the wariness, the judge saw something else, a spark of hope, fragile but unmistakable. They sat in her living room, and she told them her story. She had met Daniel Marsh at a church function, she said. He had been charming, attentive, everything a woman could want. They married after 6 months of courtship. For the first year, things had been good. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small criticisms. The way she cooked dinner, the way she dressed, the friends she spent time with. Gradually, those criticisms became something darker. Not physical. He was too clever for that. But psychological, emotional. A systematic campaign to make her doubt her own sanity, her own worth, her own perception of reality. She had kept a journal, she said. At first, just to remind herself that what was happening was real. Later, because she knew she might need proof someday. She had recorded conversations without his knowledge. She had photographed things he had destroyed and blamed her for destroying. She had documented everything, hidden in a safety deposit box that he never knew existed. When she finally found the courage to leave, She had taken nothing with her except that box. She had changed her name, moved across state lines, and tried to build a new life. But the fear had never left her. "I always knew he would do it again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men like him do not stop. They cannot. And I have spent 15 years waiting for the moment when I would hear about another victim, wondering if I should have come forward sooner, wondering if I could have prevented it." She looked at the judge with tears in her eyes. "Can you stop him?" Judge Whitmore reached across the table and took her hand. "We can," he said, "but we need your help. We need everything you have." She nodded slowly. Then she stood and walked to a closet in the hallway. When she returned, she was carrying a small lockbox. "I have been waiting 15 years to give this to someone," she said. "Please make sure it matters." The drive back to Indiana was quieter than the drive out. The lockbox sat on the seat between them, its contents representing 15 years of pain and fear and desperate hope. As the sun set behind them, Judge Whitmore looked out the window and made a silent promise. To Helen Porter, to Danny Reeves, to all the people who had been failed by a system that should have protected them. This time would be different. The evidence from Helen Porter was devastating. Audio recordings that captured Daniel Marsh's true nature in his own words. Photographs of property he had destroyed. A journal that documented years of manipulation and control with meticulous detail. Combined with Danny Reeves's notebook, it painted a picture that no defense attorney could dismiss. Judge Whitmore recused himself from the case, as was proper. But he made sure it was assigned to a colleague he trusted, Judge Maria Santos, a woman known for her fairness and her unwillingness to let technicalities obscure the truth. The trial was held 3 months later. Daniel Marsh sat at the defense table in a suit and tie, his expression calm and confident. He had hired a high-priced attorney from Indianapolis, a man known for getting clients acquitted on technicalities. But as the evidence was presented, Danny's notebook, Helen's recordings, testimony from neighbors who had noticed things they had been too afraid to report, that confidence began to crack. The turning point came when Helen Porter took the stand. She spoke for 2 hours, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her face. She described the systematic destruction of her self-worth, the isolation from friends and family, the constant fear that had defined 8 years of her life. And she looked directly at Daniel Marsh as she spoke. "I was silent for 15 years, she said. "I was silent because I was afraid. Because I thought no one would believe me. Because he had convinced me that I was worthless, that I deserved what happened to me. But I am not silent anymore, and I will never be silent again." The courtroom was still. Even the defense attorney did not interrupt. Daniel Marsh was convicted on multiple charges. The sentence was 12 years. As he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, he finally lost the mask he had worn for so long. His face twisted with rage, and he shouted something at the judge that the bailiffs quickly silenced. But Judge Whitmore, watching from the gallery, did not hear the words. He was looking at Danny Reeves, who sat in the front row with his grandmother, his maternal grandmother, who had driven from Ohio the moment she learned the truth and had petitioned for custody the same day. The boy was not smiling. He was too young, too wounded, too aware of what he had lost. But he was safe. And for the first time in years, he was looking toward a future that did not hold fear. After the verdict, Judge Whitmore walked outside to the courthouse steps. The afternoon sun was warm, and the trees that lined the street were beginning to bloom with the first colors of spring. Marcus Cole was waiting for him by the curb, leaning against his motorcycle. The judge walked over and stood beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus reached into his vest and pulled out something small. He held it out to the judge. It was a patch, the skull with wings, the emblem of the Iron Guardians. But this one was different. Instead of the full insignia, it was smaller, simpler, a single wing beside a set of scales. "It is not official," Marcus said, "but the club voted. We want you to have it, as a symbol of what you did, of who you became. Judge Whitmore took the patch and turned it over in his hands. He thought about everything that had happened: the courtroom confrontation, the investigation, the trip to Kentucky, the trial. He thought about the assumptions he had made and the lessons he had learned. "I judged you before I knew you," he said quietly. "I saw the leather and the motorcycles, and I thought I knew everything I needed to know. I was wrong." Marcus nodded. "Most people are. That is why we keep doing what we do. Because changing minds matters as much as changing laws." The judge looked up at the veteran, the biker, the protector, and he extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Marcus shook it. "No. Thank you, Your Honor, for listening, for seeing, for choosing to care." As the two men stood there in the spring sunlight, something had changed in Cedar Falls. Not just in the law books or the court records, but in the hearts of the people who had witnessed what happened. A judge had learned humility, a veteran had found an ally, and a boy had found hope. 3 months later, Danny Reeves stood in front of the Cedar Falls Community Center, surrounded by members of the Iron Guardians. It was their annual charity ride, 100 motorcycles raising money for veteran mental health services. Danny was too young to ride, but Marcus had given him a special job. He held the flag that led the procession, the American flag that had flown outside the clubhouse for as long as anyone could remember. As the engines roared to life and the parade began its slow march through town, Danny looked up at the sky. The sun was bright, the air was warm, and for the first time in his young life, he felt like he belonged. Judge Whitmore watched from the sidewalk, the small patch tucked safely in his pocket. Beside him stood Tom Bradley, Rita, Thomas, and a dozen others who had played their part in the story. "You know," Tom said quietly, "when you first told me you were going to talk to the bikers, I thought you had lost your mind." The judge smiled. "So did I," he admitted. "But sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from admitting how little we know." The motorcycles passed by, chrome gleaming, engines thundering. And at the front of the procession, a 9-year-old boy held a flag high, surrounded by men and women who had sworn to protect him. In the crowd, someone began to clap, then another, until the entire street was filled with applause, not for a judge, not for a verdict, but for something deeper. For the reminder that courage comes in many forms, that heroes wear many faces, and that sometimes the people we fear the most are the ones who will save us. The story of Cedar Falls spread beyond the town limits. News stations picked it up, magazines wrote about it, and the Iron Guardians received more requests for help than they had ever received before, from veterans, from children, from families who had nowhere else to turn. Judge Whitmore retired from the bench 2 years later, but he did not disappear into quiet obscurity. Instead, he became an advocate, traveling the country, speaking to law schools and judicial conferences about the importance of looking beyond appearances, about the danger of assumptions, about the courage required to admit when you are wrong, and every speech ended the same way. "I spent 32 years believing I could read people," he would say. "I thought I knew who the criminals were and who the heroes were. And then I met a man in a leather vest who taught me that justice is not about what someone looks like. It is about who they are. It is about what they do. And it is about having the humility to admit when you have been blind." Marcus Cole continued to lead the Iron Guardians until his health no longer allowed it. On his last ride, Danny Reeves, now 18 years old, rode beside him. The boy had grown into a young man with broad shoulders and steady eyes. He had enlisted in the Marines, following in the footsteps of the man who had saved him. And before he left for basic training, he gave Marcus a gift. It was a drawing, simple but powerful. It showed 2 figures, a large one and a small one, standing side by side. Above them, in careful letters, were the words, "Family is who shows up." Marcus framed that drawing and hung it in the clubhouse, next to the photographs of all the veterans who had passed through its doors. And every time a new member asked about it, he would tell the story. The story of a boy who walked 6 miles to find hope. the story of a judge who learned to see, and the story of a brotherhood that believed, above all else, that no one should ever face their battles alone. If you watched this far, it is because you believe in these truths too. Leave a comment saying I watched this far so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Hit the like button if this story touched your heart. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe if you want to be part of a community that believes courage, honor, and compassion can still change the world. Because in a world that often forgets what matters, stories like this remind us. Justice is not a building. It is not a robe. It is not a gavel. Justice is a choice. And every day, in ways large and small, we have the power to make it. The motorcycles faded into the distance, their rumble echoing through the streets of Cedar Falls. The sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And somewhere, in a small town in Indiana, a flag still flew above an old converted barn, a symbol of brotherhood, of service, and of the belief that no matter how dark the story starts, goodness always rides in.